Welcome to our Voices of Africa podcast, brought to you by Africa Practice, a strategic advisory firm supplying insights and advocacy solutions to corporations, investors, governments, and foundations in Africa. In a world with complex and interdependent challenges, we take the guesswork out of business engagement. We enable our clients to see more clearly in order to drive sustainable and equitable development.
Hello and welcome to Voices of Africa, the podcast where I get to speak to Africa's changemakers, trailblazers, people who are shaping the future of our continent. This week, we're going to be focusing on the role of philanthropy in addressing poverty, polarization, and rising inequality on our continent. I'm delighted that we have persuaded Jessica Horn, the Regional Director for East Africa at the Ford Foundation, to join us today. Hello, Jessica.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. Thank you for joining us. So Jessica, as I mentioned, is with the Ford Foundation based in Nairobi, where she oversees the foundation's grant making in the region. She has a career spanning almost 2 decades, where she's dedicated herself to advancing social justice and challenging inequalities with a particular focus on East Africa and a particular focus, I think I'm right in saying, or I know I'm right in saying, on women's rights. A little bit of background, but I'm going to invite Jessica to introduce herself properly in a moment. But she's a self-described African feminist, a graduate of the United World College in America, of Smith College also, and the London School of Economics. And for those of you who don't know the Ford Foundation, it was established in 1936 by the son of the founder of the Ford Motor Company, Edsel Ford, the founder, of course, being Henry, with an initial gift of $25,000. And the foundation works all across the world. I think it's 11 regions, in fact, investing in strengthening public participation in the political, cultural, and economic systems that shape our lives. We're going to hear a bit more about the work of the Ford Foundation in a moment. But it works across broadly 9 interconnected areas: civic engagement, government, creativity, free expression, disability rights, future of work, gender and racial justice, governance, natural resources and climate change, technology and society. So a really broad portfolio. So Jessica, over to you. Thank you so again for joining us. I'd be grateful if you just introduced yourself and tell us a bit about the motivations for the career choices that you've made and the work that you do today with the Ford Foundation.
Thank you so much. Really, it's a pleasure to be here. It may make sense to work backwards in terms of beginning with philanthropy. So I actually fell into philanthropy in part by chance. I was in my mid-20s, and I have to say that at that time, I was a bit of a unicorn demographically, because there were definitely not many young women or young African women or young Black women in this space. But what I've loved about it is that it has been an opportunity to actually bring an ecosystemic think, right? Because one of the beauties of philanthropy is that it gives you a bird's eye view on systems, on relationships, on the big questions facing society, and then enables you to provide the resourcing. I always say that society doesn't necessarily lack ideas, but it definitely lacks the resources to implement them. So again, one of the great powers, I think, of philanthropy is the ability to resource brilliant ideas, and ideas that are, again, helping to kind of shift the envelope, raise new questions, support a range of actors to be able to solve some of the difficult problems of our time. I have sustained work in social justice and a grounding in feminist work all of this time, really because of my family background. I come from lineages of quite different types of work, but all intersecting around, again, a real care about society and a kind of strong sense of duty or responsibility to contribute to society. And so I think because I had that family background, I, of course, was always, guided towards education that would help strengthen my capacity to both analyze the world and understand what the core drivers that shape the world are, but also build the technical ability to be able to contribute to changing it. So that's really how I've ended up here. And I carry a very deep commitment to this continent. And I have East African heritage. So it's a pleasure, again, to be able to contribute in this way to bringing out East African leadership in questions which are ultimately global, right? Which are ultimately human questions about how we are going to choose to structure society going forward. we're at a lot of junctures with regards to the environment, with regards to governance, with regards to how we want to manage social power, right? With regards to economies. And I really do think that East Africans have a contribution to make, not just for our own communities, but also to global conversations about how we're reimagining the world.
Well, thank you, Jessica. I can see all the family influences that shaped your choices for your career and your passion. Can we turn to the work of the Ford Foundation that you direct in East Africa? Tell us about how the Ford Foundation approaches its work in the region.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, the Ford Foundation was created, about 80 years ago now, is independent from the Ford family and the Ford Motor Corporation. So it's an independent philanthropic foundation with an endowment, which is where we generate the resources to support this work globally. But interestingly, it's one of the early pioneers of philanthropy in the US, but very soon after also began to open offices around the world. So the Nairobi office was actually opened at independence in Kenya. So it's a good, 61 years old now. And in some respects has maintained some elements over the years, even though Ford as an institution and the office itself has shifted in terms of its terrains of focus over the decades, because of course you have to remain relevant and you have to stay funding and stay resourcing in ways that make sense for the questions of the time. But for me, one of the core pillars has always actually been this focus on investing in regional leadership, regional skills, regional knowledge to apply to the problems that people are facing domestically and regionally. So from the very beginning, Ford, because the office opened in independence, we actually to this day, if you look at the largest cumulative grants ever given, in the top 10 are actually grants to the national universities in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. We also supported universities in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, because it was an office for East and Southern Africa at that time, as many of the countries were still under colonial rule or apartheid rule. So that's one thing that's remained. Ford is also, I think, kind of funded in its funding approach in a way that, is now become an agreement, right, around the best way to fund. But Ford's kind of always done it. So Ford funds as much as possible, flexible, right? Flexible funding, resources, institutions, and not just projects long term. And we kind of have ended up with a cumulative long-termist approach. Many of the partners that we seeded maybe 20 years ago, we're still with them today. And we're an ecosystem funder. And so again, Ford has always, looked to make ecosystemic contributions. Many know us as a civil society funder, but we actually don't only fund civil society. We do fund pieces of government. We have private sector origins, of course, and I think we maintain the strongest links to private sector in terms of looking at investment. So we have, we were an early pioneer of program-related and mission-related investment, and we're now building out impact investing as a model, impact investing for social justice and ending inequality in many places around the world. And lastly, we are a philanthropy and so have actually always encouraged the development of flourishing philanthropic ecosystems and, the idea that resourcing can and should come from everywhere. So on the African continent, Akwasi Aidu in particular was very important at Ford some years ago, decades ago, in pushing and pioneering the endowment and seeding of a lot of African philanthropic institutions. And in East Africa, we maintain that work. We fund the philanthropic network, but we're also really keen to push the conversation from funding to financing and resourcing, because we know also that as East Africa goes through its economic transitions and becomes an upper middle income country, the countries are also going to face the question of what to do when there's no aid, right? And the resourcing that comes from aid budgets. And so it's good time to preempt, a resourcing crisis and actually start thinking about how do we do domestic and regionally generated resourcing that begins to create new pools of support for the work that needs to be done. So the East Africa office has a focus on advancing civic space. So civic space is the idea of a social, cultural, and policy environment that nurtures and sustains vibrant democracies. And so for us, it means looking at sort of the nuts and bolts of civic space, so sort of the basic freedoms and basic rights and how they are protected or not in the environments that we work in. Also thinking very strongly about how that maps onto the digital and how we think about building out digital spaces that, again, are respectful of civic space, but also advance technology in the public interest. Of course, it's critical to look at narratives, and that's something that we'll get into when we speak about polarization and the narratives that circulate around widely held values and the extent to which we value basic freedoms and we value sort of the underpinnings of democracy. And also thinking about resilience and protection, because again, when you do work that's challenging deep structural inequality, very often there is a response, and that response again can be complex. At times it can be dangerous. And so to think about how do we then also ensure that all of the actors in the space are resilient enough to be able to deal with that and to push forward in terms of being able to nurture and sustain the work and to continue to nurture, this kind of collective agreement about how we want to live together in ways that are equal and just. So we fund a range of actors to do this. In the narrative space, we actually fund quite a bit of independent media, and quite a bit of that is actually quote unquote private sector. I mean, a lot of independent media is actually registered as media companies. I think sometimes when we say private sector, we immediately think about either multinational corporations or the finance sector. And I think it's important to recognize that actually there's especially African economies, right, are structured around a whole range of different kinds of private sector actors. And that includes, again, some of these entities that are really looking to sort of bridge, again, to do work that's ultimately private sector in terms of its format, but also very much done in the public interest. Around the explicit question of financing, so we just seeded the creation of Impact Investing Kenya, which is a national advisory board on impact investing, and it's bringing together a really interesting set of actors across the investment space, but also government and policy space, to really think about what would a vibrant, well-organized, visionary impact investing ecosystem look like in Kenya. We know that Kenya is one of Africa's largest economies, and there's a lot of innovation here, and that brings also a lot of different kinds of financing to the table. And so the question is, what would this look like again if it was imagined in a more systematic way and imagined again sort of together? Of course, not to limit what's happening, but to kind of actually actively encourage the growth of this type of intervention.
Fascinating to hear. There's a common theme around the work that you do in investing in organizations and individuals and supporting more active civic participation and public participation in the system, in decision making, in the process of arriving at decisions, most specifically in the areas of policy that shapes those societies. I wonder if you're genuinely satisfied that we have achieved over the last 5 years, decade, greater public participation in policymaking, decision-making, and if that's leading, in your view, to a greater quality of policy with better result and better prosperity in sight, at least.
I mean, I think it's interesting, actually, when we talk about policy processes and improvements, because change is actually not linear. And in particular, in complex ecosystems like policy ecosystems, it's not linear because it depends on the actors engaged at any time. And interestingly, those actors change when it comes to policy because it's very often dealing with elected bodies who cycle in and out, right? So in different ways, so you may be dealing with judiciaries that change, with executives that change, etc. So in some respects, I feel like it's hard to make a linear analysis of that. I also think that if you look globally, we are in a moment of what we call elected authoritarianism and the rise, of a kind of swing back to a state that I think, say in the 70s, for example, there was a lot of work and effort to contest. And we're back in that space again in many contexts, right? This is also the year of elections where, a significant portion of the globe is actually going to elections. So again, for me, I think we have to, when we think about policy work, of course, we would like to look at it in the sort of hard-nosed sense of we can see X, Y, and Z, right? Processes that have gone well. At the same time, we have to recognize that it's like an accordion. It really does expand and contract depending on the environment. But there are a few things that I think are interesting. So in this office, we're very aware that in East Africa, a very large section of the population are young, not even voters, right? Very young. And so we have a portfolio that has quite a big investment in engaging young people to understand and participate in governance. And, a lot of that actually means understanding law and understanding budgeting, because in some respects, those are the two things that actually shape governance. And we've actually had some very interesting successes in engaging and skilling up younger people around local government and local government processes. I think sometimes local government is easier to engage because it's slightly more contained. Obviously, at national level, it's quite a big panoply of actors to be dealing with. The second is that the Ford Foundation was an early funder of the Open Government Partnership. It's this idea of creating transparency in systems and greater collaboration between government and civil society actors, including also the private sector in different ways, to encourage, again, the mechanisms that enable open government. This year, Kenya is actually co-hosting the OGP. And we've been very involved again in supporting those processes. And there's some very interesting things that have come out of it. Of course, Kenya is really a global pioneer in digital governance. And so, again, that's one of the areas that they're looking at, is how to think about digital governance broadly, but also digital mechanisms for this engagement as well. And I think, the other thing is just, again, that the process of education and skilling people up and also encouraging engagement is an ongoing one. It's not actually one that you can invest in, say, for 3 years and then it's done. We have to keep skilling up, keep engaging people in terms of being able to understand the core tenets of the institutions that govern their lives, and again, how to engage in influencing them. And so we really always think about pipeline and about how we continue to support people's capacity to do that, as we also support the actors doing the work itself.
Well, thank you. That was illuminating, and I love the analogy you gave of the accordion. I think that's very, very apt. I wanted to turn to the work of the foundation in promoting cultural narratives and harnessing the creative arts to contribute to fairer and more just societies. It's quite a unique approach, I think, to see a big foundation focuses intently on this area's work in the way that the foundation does. I know that you personally have a history and a background in writing and the arts and artistic projects. Can you speak to the work that you do in promoting cultural narratives and harnessing the creative arts, and why specifically it's so important for addressing inequalities in our society and for shaping public dialogue?
So the Ford Foundation really is a legacy donor in arts and creative space everywhere. Certainly in the US, it was, work, early funding that it gave helped to create Sesame Street.
Oh, really?
Which is a global educational classic, the National Endowment for the Arts. Darren Walker, our current president, has obviously really been a champion of that and has funded incredible work, as well as through, obviously, our creativity of free expression thematic, and my colleagues there who, again, have really been pushing those questions. Ford has a big investment in documentary film, just really to encourage the growth of documentary film ecosystems. We've moved into a hypervisual storytelling mode, with social media. It kind of pushed us there. And I think it's critical that we start thinking about all these different mediums and think again about things like the power of film to communicate, to document, and to raise questions. In East Africa, the Nairobi office created a arts and culture portfolio in 2010, and it had specific allocated money. And really that helped to almost supercharge our investments in the creative space. We helped at that time to seed and kind of develop some of the, and what have now become or were anchor institutions in the art scene. So in Kenya, the Go Down Art Center, Kona Trust, Kwani, which was a really incredible literary journal that was the first to actually publish literature in Sheng, which is like a slang spoken in Nairobi, but also spaces like the Zanzibar International Film Festival, etc. That particular explicit portfolio closed down, but the interest to sustain and connection to the art space retained to some extent over time. And have been re-engaging it also to think about ways that we can encourage more investment, not just from Ford, but kind of a bigger ecosystem to resource this. Why? So you asked the question of why. I think that particularly in the highly functionalist ways that we think about quote unquote Africa and what Africa needs, it's easy to erase art and culture because it seems frivolous in the face of, mass starvation or, like poverty and famine or whatever. And I just think that that's incredibly myopic. It's also not true to the ways that African societies across the continent are structured. So I think one of the things that's common in every African society, and obviously this is a continent of, billions of people, but is that the aesthetic is central, right? The aesthetic is central. And so, there is great meaning and great value in the word and how it's used. So there are many cultures that have, griot cultures, praise poetry, theater performance, dance, music, right? And visual art in different ways, fashion, all of that is actually central to African cultures across the continent. So that's one thing. The second is that art and artists are critical as forms of social documentary. And I think if we're trying to think about the world and what it looks like, art gives us that mirror, right? Or it gives us sometimes an imagination to think completely outside of what we know into new worlds. And again, that's also critical. And so that again is, to me, it's almost like the pulse, and it helps to nourish the ecosystems that we work in around, questions of justice, addressing inequality, and trying to, again, sustain or create vibrant democracies. This question is central, right? The aesthetic is central, culture is central. Again, because of the functionalist way that Africa is understood, we're almost obliged to put the creative into creative economy to make the argument that there's value in it because it can make money and it can contribute to GDP. And while to some extent that is a fair analysis, I also think we need to think about creative economies in the sense that culture workers do need to be paid, and culture institutions do need to be financed. And actually it needs to be understood as an economic contribution so that it's appropriately remunerated and resourced in that way. And at the same time, to understand its value is beyond an economic contribution, right? Creativity is about applying different visions, sourcing different visions. It's about a polyphonic conversation, right? A rallying different kinds of vantage points in the process of thinking about and designing change. It's a practice, right? It's a practice. It's something that's trained. And so there, I do think that arts and creative practitioners can also have something to share with others who are maybe not as attuned, to how to engage creativity and think about how that applies to all the domains, how it applies to policy, how it applies to analysis, how it applies to thinking about how we structure the world.
Wow. Well, you make a very compelling case as to why we should be investing in the creative arts and creative artists and their important role in shaping our societies and policy, specifically in the way that you referenced. Thank you, Jessica, for that. That was really wonderful to hear. I'd like to turn now to gender, to women's rights specifically. I'm specifically interested to hear examples of achievements that have been made, countries that have been successful in sort of building the scaffolding for feminist futures, and what lessons we can draw from their experience, not just that could be perhaps transferred to other African nations, but perhaps that could teach the world and feminist movements worldwide about approaches to achieving progress on this crucial issue.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I've actually just written a book on African feminist praxis. It's coming out early next year. And it was a useful opportunity to actually do more research and actually look back into the history. And it's interesting, a few points. So one of the things is to remember that African women's sort of organized contribution to transforming the world is not new. So in the colonial era, in the colonial encounter in particular, the European colonial encounter was highly gendered, and actually where many societies on the African continent, actually women had more political and economic and social power. But colonists came and imposed a diminished understanding of that. And so in many cases where women had been, say, central to the economy, across coastal West Africa, women actually managed and controlled trade, especially in basic commodities like food. Women had roles in political systems. All of that was undermined because colonists couldn't imagine that that would be possible, and put in place, regimes that we're still dealing with today in law, in policy, but even in social thinking around the role of women. And so, of course, nobody takes oppression lightly. And so African women always organized against it, actually. And so you have examples, for example, in Kenya of women tea workers who were on colonial tea plantations who actually consciously organized both as workers and as women because they were being treated differently to contest those labor conditions. Nigeria has this famous example of the Aba women in southeastern Nigeria who were basically having to pay a gendered tax. It was only being applied to women. We know that colonial systems worked very heavily through taxation and led what is now a famous uprising, quite colorful uprising that actually resulted in a change, and actually in the colonial administration and including its domestic counterparts, because of course, they rallied where in countries with indirect rule, they rallied men to play their role, and the women managed to overturn that. South Africa, has a long history of actually multiracial women's participation in anti-apartheid struggle. 1956 was this famous. It was actually the first multiracial protest against apartheid. It was organized by women against the pass laws, and a march on union buildings in Pretoria. And this was actually of great interest to women in the West at the time, who were also rallying, or building out feminisms. And actually, there were women who traveled, to the region to document and try and understand how women are organizing. Of course, all that history doesn't get told, doesn't get documented, and is sort of eliminated. And so we then end up with a current scenario where people are trying to claim that African feminisms are Western, but actually they emerged as an anti-West critique, truthfully. African feminisms actually arose in response to Western impositions and Western recalibrations of women's power. So that's sort of an irony. So again, we have this sort of early contestation, which also signals the fact that, African feminisms have contributed this vantage point that we have to think ecosystemically about change. So it's not just a question of addressing this particular social norm or that particular law. We have to think in an ecosystemic fashion. So, for example, when we're thinking about women's rights and gender equality on the continent, we always have to ask the question of where does this fit into the political economy of the world, right? Who does it serve for African women to be in this position, right? Of being low paid or unrecognized, or whatever. Who benefits from that? So we always have to think about economy and think about the structures that inhibit justice. What is the system of, governance here, and how is that entrenching or enabling? The second is that, African feminisms have always been interested in both the individual and the collective. Because the feminisms come out of the way that, people in their own environments understand society, we always talk about African social structures as being collectivist. Very often people speak about this notion of Ubuntu, which is, slightly generalized for the continent. It comes out of certain systems, but it's true that actually in all environments, people have this great understanding or sensitivity to how interconnected we are, and actually how we live in social systems. We live in communities of different kinds. And so anytime we're thinking about change, we can't just think about change to the individual. We have to think about change in a social ecosystem, and how, different parts of that ecosystem are affected when things change. And it's interesting. So if you look at the current work on prevention of violence against women, there is this whole universe of very interesting work, evidence-based work around how you prevent violence against women. It is notable to me that the two studies, there were randomized control studies that kind of helped to pioneer this field, were conducted on the African continent in communities where, and again, with, design direction, design input from African women. So the SASA trial and the image study, which was in Uganda, and then the image study was in South Africa. So again, how do we think about transformation in ecosystemic ways? And to understand that the agenda is not just about changing individuals, it's also about changing our relationships between each other, otherwise known as thinking about the collective. Just lastly to say, it's interesting, we're in a moment where women's political leadership is an enduring question. Mexico has elected its first woman president in its history. She actually came in with the largest majority of any president in Mexico's history. And Mexico is, very significant, very large country. I think it's important to note that Africa's actually had women heads of state since the 1970s. And they've actually been to date 22 African women heads of state or heads of government. Of course, it's insufficient. There's nowhere in this world where women are fully equal to men statistically, socially, otherwise. And the continent has a long way to go. We're also dealing with a very organized backlash against women's rights and gender justice questions. Yeah. So again, we're dealing with that accordion, right? And we're in a moment in many places of contraction. But I just want to recognize the pioneering contribution that's been there. And again, to just say, I don't think it's taken seriously enough. And I think we need to, if we're going to think about, how we learn from this globally towards more gender just spaces and societies.
Well, that's fascinating to hear. Can you remind us of the title of the book that you've authored and when that'll be out?
Sure. It's called African Feminist Praxis, Cartographies of Liberatory World Making. And it's going to be out in 2025 with Sage Publishers.
Oh, well, fabulous. Congratulations on that. It was fascinating to hear you speak to the subject of feminism and the roots of African feminism. It's often overlooked and, interesting to hear you talk about the sort of colonially imposed patriarchy as well. So I look forward very much to reading your book. I flagged it at the outset, but I wanted us to focus a little bit on the work that the Ford Foundation does on addressing polarization in our societies. We know that, unfortunately, the gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger. In fact, in Africa, it is the biggest gap in the world, with the exception of Latin America, and it's growing. And this is exacerbating polarization in our societies. Polarization, of course, is not unique to African societies. We're seeing it in some of our most developed democracies all over the world. And I think it's a cause for great concern, leading to social tensions, lack of social cohesion in society. Tell us about the work of the foundation in addressing polarization. I know you've got a big initiative in Train. I'd love for our audience to learn more about that.
So one of the ways that the Ford Foundation structures our interventions is that we have kind of standing thematics, but of course we're dealing in a highly mobile world, right, where things change quite rapidly. And I also just think that in general, the world is in a moment of rapid transformation. Like there's a lot of things that are changing very fast. So the polarization work was really pioneered by our Executive Vice President, Hilary Pennington, in collaboration with a number of colleagues to try and have a proactive platform that would bring together different kinds of actors to just try and take stock and understand firstly what's going on. So there's a really strong knowledge component here and convening component, which is really to just take a moment, which again, we often don't take time to do or to resource, to just analyze what's actually going on. Like what are the questions on the table? Who are the actors? What are the narratives that they use? Who is doing the dividing and why, right? What interest is this serving? There's power in the method of even in how we do the work to be depolarizing, right? So we bring together people from a range of different backgrounds, often different vantage points in a convening capacity to co-think, and so there's, again, an analytical research component. So it means that there are researchers and academics, civil society activists who form a good, quite a significant component of our grantee network, but not all, as I mentioned, religious leaders, people coming from different vantage points to really unpick what are the trends, what's going on, but also what do we then do to intervene. The other thing that's really become apparent is that, polarization, it's an active choice to polarize, right? So it's true that there's inequality, but inequality is not in and of itself polarizing. It can actually be the opportunity for deep transformation. All of the social movements that we see, for example, that are focused on justice come out of inequality. We've just spoken about feminism, right? So there's deep gendered inequality. And in response to that, people have actually created movements to address that in an affirming way, right? The same could be true of anything: racial justice and racial inequalities, ethnic inequalities, class inequalities, etc. So the question is, why is it that actors who are seeking to use this moment of deeper inequality to then accelerate processes of encouraging hate or encouraging conflict, encouraging antagonism, right? Why are they doing that and how they do it? Narratives are critical to that. And so we've been doing a lot of work just trying to understand the narrative infrastructure, how ideas spread, what makes, anti-community, anti-togetherness, anti-love, anti heterogeneous anti-democratic narratives, what makes them compelling. And we know now that it's a lot of fear-based narrative construction alongside the promise, right, of something more hopeful, but of course that serves the interests of a few, that serves the interests of whatever constituency people are appealing to, very often harking back to, a time when that constituency could dominate, or the dream of dominating, right? As opposed to living in harmony with people. In the East African region, we support quite a bit of work that's looking at mis and disinformation ecosystems and trying to understand and analyze how they work, but then also to help support, again, the creation of more affirming narratives that really do support the idea that ultimately we're in this world together, and we need to find a way to have grace and to adopt a posture where we're open actually to the fact that we are and will always be tremendously diverse as humanity, and there's no way to get around that. And that also, there is a value base needed there around a commitment to living with each other and to figuring out how we do that fairly.
Well, thank you for sharing some of that work. Instructive to hear that the process is as important as whatever initiatives it is that one chooses to support, to back, to drive. I think we find that with all of the work that we do at Africa Practice as well, the importance of having a genuinely inclusive process to arrive at the initiative and deliver the outcome. We're coming to the end of our allotted time, and I wanted to ask you one final question, if I may. It's a question we ask all of our guests. If you could paint for us, from your perspective, a picture of a prosperous Africa that inspires the world.
Yeah, thanks. So by 2030, I believe it's 1 in 5 people in the world will be an African, and that number starts to increase exponentially. And so my question is, okay, so as Africans, what are we saying about philanthropy? I think we need to have a real look at the origin of the resourcing of philanthropy and to think about how we also build out more infrastructure for resourcing that is driven from the continent itself. We do know that, for example, diaspora remittances account for astronomically more than total ODA or even philanthropy contributions on the continent. How do we think about that then, as contributing again to sort of the advancement of African communities and African societies? So for me, part of the future of philanthropy is really thinking again about, how is it shifting in line with the reality of the world, and how are we looking and thinking about African agency in that? The other thing is that if resourcing is going to continue in some respects the way it is, not necessarily in origin, but in format, I think some of what Ford has been trying to do over the years really needs to be taken seriously. That again, the most effective way to fund any work that is ultimately long-term work, the work of justice, the work of transforming society, even development, rights, whatever framework you're coming at, is not a short-term agenda. It could never be, right? You have to think in medium to long term and fund in ways that enable that. So we need to fund in flexible ways. We need to fund the thinking and enable, move away from this project obsession, which doesn't help because it actually doesn't, again, enable entities to really do the work of deep thinking and of innovation, right? We need to look at things like true cost recovery and making sure that overhead and admin is resourced properly. It sounds boring, but actually it's critical if we're going to want to see vibrant work that sustains over the long term. So I think that that's critical too. To link then to the question of, a prosperous Africa, in some respects, the visions are linked because ultimately a prosperous Africa rests on 2 things. One is agency and the second is autonomy. This continent belongs first and foremost to the people of the continent. And I do think that a prosperous Africa, is basically a space that is an ongoing space of prosperity. There's no final destination, right, of a prosperous Africa. A prosperous Africa is an Africa that is structured in ways that enable for ongoing agency and ongoing autonomy. The active, enabled, empowered leadership and shaping of the continent by its very diverse constituencies that are here, fully inclusive of all the questions. Yes, this continent must be gender just. Yes, there must be disability justice. Yes, we really do need to contend with what it means to have very, very young people, right? A majority of very young people on this continent. What does that mean for the ways we think about governance, about leadership, about what's important in society, about the way that we design social space, right? The way that we design social policy. I also think that lastly, we spoke a little bit about climate, but we can't get over the fact that we're living on a planet that we have undermined, Well, we're dealing with climate crisis, and we know that the African continent is a source of all of the minerals and to some extent even some of the labor needed, right, for energy transitions and to think about, new climate realities. And so for me, again, as we look at that agency and autonomy, how do we imagine solutions for the quote unquote world that don't undermine the African continent and African peoples again, right? We don't need to go through a second wave of the things that we've already been through. Actually, we need to be thinking forward and thinking with African people about what are just ways for the world and how Africa can achieve a justice in the world, right? And also a justice for Africa itself.
Well, Jessica, we're at the end of our interview. Thank you so much for sparing the time to talk to us today. It's been a real tour de force. We've covered women's rights, polarization and addressing polarization in our societies, the contribution and role of culture and creative arts. And you made the point for investing in the creative arts so powerfully. We've just touched on the future of philanthropy, the importance of resourcing to enable more African agency, more African autonomy, and the contribution of that to the constant exercise to promote prosperity on the continent and share prosperity. It's been fascinating to hear you. I am so impressed by the perspectives that you've shared with us today, and I know our audience will love learning from you. Thank you so much for being our guest today, Jessica.
Thank you too, Marcus.
Thank you for tuning into a Voices of Africa podcast this week. Voices of Africa is a forum where Africa's leading experts weigh in on cross-sectional topics affecting the continent. Experts share their views on how we can unlock greater value that will benefit industry, government, and communities. For more of our insights, visit our website or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Views on Africa, in the description.